Hey everybody, it's Jochen Hyde, and I'm back with another tutorial in my tutorial series. Today we're going to be talking about task force numbers. I get asked a lot of questions about this, and I don't think people understand a lot about how this works and how important the task force number is or can be. So we're going to basically cover what these task force numbers are, why they're important, and how you can manage them. So we're going to talk about basic stuff and some theory, and I'm going to maybe even get into some not so pleasant information about task force numbers that you may not want to hear. You may call it gaming, you may call it working as intended. That's up to you. You guys can be the judge. I'm just going to give you the information. So let's start with this. Task force numbers. If you want to see your task forces, you go over to this button where it says list all task forces, or you press T. And here are your task force numbers, 1 to infinity. I don't know what the maximum number of task forces are. I would assume it's maybe 999, but I don't know. A couple things you need to remember about task force numbers. They're a lot more important than you think. Why is that? Well, basically it has to do with the game engine design. While this is not 100% always the case, air quotes, Gary Grigsby has a say in things, as always. These task force numbers determine a lot. For example, the lower the task force number, typically the better if you want this task force to move, react, respond, engage first. What does that mean? Well, let's say I have a amphibious task force here, right? Task force 124, and I have it co-located with a surface combat task force that I want to run into enemy ships first before they run into this task force 124. Let's just say. One way you can try to ensure that's the case is by making sure your surface combat task force has a lower task force number than the task force you don't want to be engaged. Why is that? Well, I don't really know. I suspect it has to do with the way they designed the engine or the game coding way back when. Remember, this is an old game, guys. It's not anything modern. There's a lot of databases. There's a lot of spaghetti string code in the back end of this game. And I think for simplicity, they referenced a lot of stuff to database numbers and task force numbers, things like that. Essentially, this task force number is like a database number. What is a database number? Well, here's an example of one. Let's say I click on this unit here. You see this number in the top left corner? This is a database entry number. That means this is the 3,481st unit to be created in the database for ground units, okay? Aircraft squadrons also have database numbers. Look at that, 107. This is the 107th database entry for squadrons in the database for this scenario. And a lot of stuff is referenced to these database numbers. The lower the number, the higher the chance that that unit's going to react first, move first, respond first, do different things first. I'll give you, let me see if I can give you another example of a database thing here. Okay, so 32nd Division is 3525, right? And 8th RJC is 4234. So the lower database number in this hex is the 32nd Division. Let me show you one example of how the engine prioritizes database numbers, task force numbers. Watch this. I'm going to tell the 32nd Division to move this way. Okay. You know, I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but the arrow is pointing in the bottom left direction. Okay. Now, I'm going to tell the 8th AGC Route Brigade to move northeast. Okay. Now, there's a move arrow on both directions. However, what tends to happen here is the enemy, when they see this, is not going to see a unit moving in multiple directions. They're going to see the unit with the lowest database number with the move arrow. Okay, so you can use this to your advantage if you want to shield movement. because that's how the game works. It references database numbers, things like that. I'm going way off topic here. I probably need to get back on thing. I'm just giving you an example of how databases work. And the task forces are no exception. So it would behoove you guys to make sure you assign the task force numbers that are lowest possible to the units you want to be engaged, that you want to be out front, that you want to have the first combat. And you want to give a high database number or task force number to a unit you don't want to be engaged or to be intercepted first. Now let me tell you something else here that you may want to know. Japan is in the driver's seat as it pertains to task force number assignment. So because the Japanese player always goes first in this game, the Japanese player gets first dibs on task forces. So let me give you an example. I'm here at Tokyo and I want to make a task force. Now, how it works is when I click form new task force, the task force numbers are going to be picked based on sequential, what is available in the list from 1 to whatever. So you'll notice here, our task forces go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But you notice there's a gap here, right? Okay, now, as a Japanese player, and this is where things can get a little gamey, and I'll leave it up to you guys to manage this how you see fit. I want to preserve all of these low task force numbers as much as possible because I go first before the allied player gets to do their turn. I get the first dib on the task force numbers. So let's say I want to block off task force 18. I can assign it to a cargo ship and I'll type in something like task force 18 placeholder and I'll just leave it sitting somewhere. So now I've taken that task force number and the allied player can't have it. So let's say I make no other task forces and the allied player goes to create a task force on their turn, right? They're going to click this button and the next available number in the listing is 42. Well, they'll get 42, but they won't get 18 because I got it first. Now, if you want to be sneaky and you want to be a good Japanese player, and you're going to be like, oh, that's a low task force number. I want that. So I'll just grab it myself. Right? And you can keep doing this until all of these task force numbers are taken up as far as you want them to go. Okay? Because the allied player doesn't get to decide that until it's their turn. Well, that's something you should know about task force numbers and reserving them if you're the Japanese player. And the allied player can do this too if the Japanese player is sleeping at the wheel and he didn't do this at the beginning of his turn. Because let me show you something else that'll happen here. And this is just for display purposes only. If I take this task force 2 and I disband it, that task force gets recycled back into the listing and it is available for you again. See 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, if I don't do anything as a Japanese player to create a new task force to take advantage of that, when the allied player comes in and he wants to create a task force, he will get that task force number, right? But because I'm instantly going to recreate a new task force, I get the number back. So that's something to keep in mind, guys. Manage your task force numbers carefully. If you disband a task force that has a low task force number, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even if you don't have an immediate need for it, you may want to create a placeholder task force to reserve that number for you later on. I'll give you an example of why you might want to do this now. Okay. Let's create a placeholder task force because I want to have task force 2 for my own uses at some point later on. So I'm going to just pick a random ship here and I'll go task force 2 placeholder. Okay. It's just going to sit there. You don't have to do this in Tokyo. You can do it anywhere. Now let's say we're over here in Malaya and I've got task force 11 here, but I don't like that task force number. Let's say it was 111, but I want this task force to lead the charge down towards Singapore, and I want them to be the first ones to get it, to seek combat, to attract attention, to engage the four things that are following behind it. But let's pretend this is Task Force 111. And I'm like, oh, I don't like that. I want this to be Task Force 2. I want it to have the lowest possible task force number, even lower than whatever the allies can have. But it's already Task Force 111. Well, how do I fix that? Let me show you. What you can do is you go into your list of task forces and you find one, the lowest possible number that you can give up. In this case, it'd be Task Force 2. So what I'll do is I'll disband this one. Okay, now we've got Task Force 2 back in the available listing. Then I'll come over to this task force and I'm going to create a new task force. And now look at this. It's going to create a task force based on the next available sequential number in the listing. And because I just disbanded Task Force 2 back in the home islands, I can now create Task Force 2 here, even though I'm already in a task force. So what I'll do is I'll create it and I'll just move all of the ships over to it. And now you've changed your task force number from 111 to 2. And I didn't have to do anything but find a task force that had a low number, disband it, and recreate a task force with the same number that I just gave up in the same turn. Again, as the Japanese player, you have an advantage here because you get first dibs on these numbers before the allies do. Now, one thing you have to remember, if you do this, if you had a custom selected admiral for that old task force, he's going to go away, and it's going to fall to the more or less the largest ship in the fleet here. And if you have four of the same that are all in the same class, for example, it's probably going to, I don't really know how they choose it, maybe based on skill or something else, rank. But you'll lose that, but you still get the lower task force number. Now, this guy can go down there and do battle and has a higher likelihood of getting engaged first, being out front first, dictating the terms of the initial react and contact. So that's more or less what I think you guys need to know about task force numbers and why they're important. Okay, the lower the number, the higher the chance that that lower numbered task force, especially when they're co-located in the same hex, will engage and will be the first to be engaged by enemy forces. So again, it'll be very handy when you want to cover it, like it's say an amphibious task force that has the task force 105, and we're going into a hex where we're expecting the enemy to counterattack our ships. Again, it's not 100% guaranteed that it's going to work this way, because Gary Grigsby, every now and then the dice don't go your way and something will sneak through and get behind it. But more often than not, that lower task force number will be important. So let's say here, let's do one more example here. I'll take one of these torpedo boats here, and this DMS. Let's say these are going to be our stand-in for a couple cruisers that we want to use, and this amphibious task force is going to invade Sok Trang next turn, but I'm expecting enemy contact on the way, and I want a surface combat task force to go in there and be the vanguard for them. I'm going to want a task force with a very low task force number. Okay, so let me look at my list of available task forces and see what low number is not that important to me. So for example, Task Force 18 has a lower number than either one of these two task forces that are going into Sok Trang, pretending that's allied. I'll go in here, I'll disband this low task force number. That puts that number back in the pot. I'll come over here, create a new surface combat task force. Oh, okay, apparently 11 was available. That's even better. I didn't realize that. That's fine. So we can create a surface combat task force with these two ships in there. Now watch this. There's 18, right? And then what I'll do is I'll give them a reaction, let's say 2, and I'll give them a patrol zone into this hex. So they're going to lead the way for the ships behind them, and they will typically attract the attention of enemy Surface ships first because they have a very low task force number, whereas these guys have a much higher task force number, and it's less likely for them to actually get engaged if a lower task force number is out in front of it. So there you go. I hope I made this a little more clear to you why you should be paying more attention to your task force numbers and how you can manage that. So again, the lower the better. If you want that lower number task force to be engaged, units that you want to protect and that you don't want to be engaged first, you want to give them a very high task force number, the highest that you can do. And again, the task forces act like a database, and they go from 1 to, I don't know, at least 999. And the Japanese player gets the first dibs on the task force numbers because we go first during the turn phases. So if you have any questions about task force numbers, by all means, please ask me, and I'll be happy to explain it to you better. You can leave the questions on the video or in over at my Discord server. I'll be happy to help you there. Good luck, guys. Bye-bye.